2024 was a record year for elections on the continent. A third of Africans going to the polls and producing some very, very interesting results indeed. But for this conversation, I really want us to explore a few things. Number one, the quality of those elections. Number two, the results that we saw and what they say about African perceptions and their institutions. Well, let me bring in my panel of experts, Zaynab Hoosen, Africa Analyst, Pangea Risk, Louw, Senior Political Analyst, Oxford Economics, and Charlie Robertson, Head of Macro Strategy, FIM Partners from the UK. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your time. Louw, let me begin perhaps with you and just talk a little bit about the number of elections. Maybe you can add a general comment in terms of what it is saying about Africa and its observance of democracy.
As you quite rightly point out, it's been an extraordinary year on the election front. We've had so many, and we've had so many really important elections. What often gets mentioned is that 5 of those elections were won by opposition parties, and that is very significant. But I think it's important to also put things within context. Some of those opposition wins in a place like Ghana, for instance, was not entirely unusual. Of course, Ghana's got a long history of power alternating between 2 parties. And this year we saw a return to power to one of those parties. So it was an opposition win, but not as earth-shattering as some of the other ones. The same sort of dynamic we saw in Mauritius, where there's also been power shifting between 2 basically dynastic families. And so the opposition won against our expectations, but that was less remarkable to what we saw in Botswana, for instance, where after 58 years in power, the BDP finally was defeated by the UDC on the 3rd time of asking. And so a really major shift taking place in Botswana. The same can be said of Senegal, where we shouldn't forget months, less than a year before that particular election, the current Prime Minister Ousmane Sonko was in jail. He was in prison, and he was ultimately barred from running. And so he allowed his close ally and friend Bassirou Faye to run in his place. They won that election, and only last month their party, PASTEF, won the legislative election. These are extraordinary events and major shifts in a place like Senegal. But then, with all of that said, with the mature democracies doing well in Ghana, Botswana, and so forth, we also saw a disastrous election in Mozambique, where we anticipated that there was going to be trouble. We anticipated that it was most likely not going to be free and fair. Yeah. That proved to be the case, and we are now in the middle of some really major civil unrest. More than 100 people have died since the election results were called on October 21st. And within all that context, we also had an election in Namibia that didn't produce a surprise, but was problematic. Yeah. To say the very least. Certainly doesn't fall into the same category as Mozambique, but there were definitely issues there. And so as much as we'd like to put forward a narrative of deeper democratization in Africa and better elections, we had an extraordinary election result in South Africa as well. There were other elections that did disappoint and left us with a sour taste in the mouth.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you if you were going to declare democracy alive and healthy across the African continent, just given the number of elections that we had. I guess in part you've answered my question. Zaynab, let me come to you. Your view, just in terms of the number of elections and perhaps a general commentary around the characterization of the outcomes of those elections.
Yes, so I completely agree with Louw, is that there are different degrees to which the elections were free and fair. And then there are also degrees to which the outcomes can be seen as a trend over the continent, but then also should be taken within their context. So while we are seeing opposition parties winning, and we might view it all in one go as a sweeping win for opposition, we do need to acknowledge the many countries that are being left behind in this, and then also acknowledge that some of these leaders had already been in power before, and it was a mere return to power for them, as seen in Mauritius and then in Ghana as well. And what is also important to note in the context specifically of Ghana and Mauritius is that the party that was in power before, they were the party that had ruled through the COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, many people all over the world and in Africa as well really felt the impact of this. I mean, in Ghana, it culminated in a debt default, which then had spillover effects for the socioeconomic circumstances of the population.
Yeah.
And then also in Mauritius, in a country that is tourism dependent, many people felt the real impact of the lockdowns and also the strict regulations that were put in during this time. So with these outcomes, we see that people are demanding a change, and the youth in Africa are becoming more politically engaged and more demanding of their governments. And this is reflected in the outcomes in Namibia, Botswana, and then even in the civil unrest in Mozambique as well. We've got an urban youth that are demanding free and fair elections in the context of where it is not being granted, and the Liberation Frelimo Party is just clinging to power and trying to resist this change.
Yeah.
But as I mentioned earlier, Africa is a major continent, and much of these outcomes have to be taken in the specific context.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what we can also celebrate is the fact that you are getting an awakening, if you like, of the political maturity of our young people, and they are certainly not afraid to voice their opinions. And I'm going to come back and we'll tease out some of the key trends that you are picking up there. Charlie, you watch us from outside, and of course you advise investors who look at the continent. When you look at the overall picture, what are your key takeaways?
I mean, I think the first thing to say is not all the elections are free and fair. We know that, but the ones that they're not changing much. Even where we've seen a change of government in Ghana or Senegal, they're not changing much. But I'd say the important thing is that people are getting a chance to express frustration. And the contrast with, say, the Sahel region, where we're just seeing one coup after another, there is frustration. This is why the coups are happening, but they're not coups where people are getting a chance to express their view. This is a decision made by some army captain who's decided to take over the country. So at least we're getting a chance for people to express the frustration, about Mauritius, as Zaynab just said, for example, the frustration about a default in Ghana. And I saw a study on this that said 18 out of 19 governments in elections lose the election after a default. And this was a study done from the late 80s to the early 2000s, but Ghana's proved it again. Sri Lanka actually a few months ago proved the same thing. But are they going to come in and change policy? Are they going to rewrite the debt deal that was agreed? Probably not.
Yeah.
In Senegal, we had these new guys, exciting change, but have they got rid of the CFA? They left the franc zone? No, they haven't. Are they defaulting on their debt as they suggested they might? No, they haven't. In fact, they've borrowed more. They've done more IMFs. I mean, it's just, there hasn't been much change, is what strikes me. I think the one exception is South Africa.
Yeah.
I think South Africa, that was the decision do you want to go down the route that Brazil's going right now? And Brazil, under Lula, high spending, has seen interest rates go up, market interest rates go up from 10% to 15% in 6 months. This is 2-year borrowing rates in Brazil, because people are saying, you know what, this is unsustainable. And the country's going to blow up if it carries on down this course.
Yeah.
South Africa rejected that and has chosen a different policy stance. And you're seeing this, the relative interest rates in South Africa are so much better than Brazil. The currency is so much more stable. So there, the market's really welcomed an election result, which has actually made a difference.
Yeah. But when you look at the outcomes, Charlie, I'm going to start with you in the next round of questions. When you look at the outcomes that we got, and the fact that you are having one of those rare things across the African continent where you have got the opposition actually coming in and taking over power without a major friction and fighting, would you not agree with me, and I'm looking on the glass half full here, that perhaps we are seeing incremental progress in terms of our institutions on the African continent and the growth of democracy on the African continent as well?
I do totally agree. And it's one of those things where it's incremental, isn't it? Every single election that happens, and the president, in Ghana, I think was the vice president had kind of accepted he lost the election even before the full results were out. There was no contest about this. There was no that each time we see that, it's making the next election more less controversial, more stable, and that does help. I think it reinforces confidence in the strength of democracy in the countries that are having those elections. It's good.
Absolutely. Celebration. And I'll celebrate that one because particularly for me, this is an important part because we have seen over the years elections being held and the will of the people being disregarded, and we're seeing sham results being announced by electoral authorities. So we celebrate this one where it appears we're getting the will of the people. Zaynab, I want to come to you and ask the question around Southern Africa in particular. And Southern Africa is interesting, isn't it? Because all those areas where we had contested results, apart from South Africa, are run by former liberation movements. Is this a problem?
So I don't see it as a problem. I see it as a natural progression in the political environment in these countries. So we are seeing in Namibia that SWAPO, they ruled after Namibia gained independence from South Africa. And since then, the opposition has been emboldened. So it is not necessarily an issue that SWAPO continues to be the ruling government or the ruling party, but there is that sense of the opposition being emboldened, the opposition gaining more ground than what we have seen before. And then in South Africa as well, we see the party, the ANC, that brought apartheid to an end. We see that the people are now demanding more of a mix. And this is part of the maturity of the Southern African parties. I mean, in Botswana, that was a shock outcome where the BDP actually completely lost. However, it is encouraging that there's a slow move towards a more mixed political environment that gives the people the opportunity to choose, and also it creates an opportunity for high level government officials to collaborate with the opposition. But however, looking forward, with considering what happened in Mozambique, there is a concern that perhaps long ruling liberation parties like in Angola will choose to cling to power regardless of what the outcome is, and then that is when I would say that there will be issues across the region.
Absolutely. Let me ask you a difficult question. Do you see a situation where ZANU-PF will lose power in Zimbabwe and say, the people of Zimbabwe, thank you very much indeed, we are gone, it's been a good time? Or indeed, the same situation happening in Mozambique, and I'll also use Angola, which you've just mentioned.
So that is a tough question, as you mentioned. But unfortunately, that is not the way that I would see it going. If there is a case where the ZANU-PF loses power, or also the MPLA in Angola, and then, however, like with the protesting and with the resistance that we see, particularly from the urban youth, there is a chance that the youth can actually stand up against these liberation movements that are just staying in power. I mean, in ZANU-PF's case, it's a bit of a different situation, but these parties, these authoritarian parties that want to cling to power, there is a chance that the population will have the platform to raise their voices and to essentially bring their power down.
Absolutely, absolutely. Louw, I want to come in and get your thoughts as well on the same, and then I would like to extend the discussion a little bit just to look at the strength, or shall we say the health of Africa's institutions, again, in light of the results that we have seen.
Well, first things first, I may have to disagree with you, Charlie. I very much see the glass as half full. I'll tell you why. I think the reality is that we have seen bad elections, specifically in Southern Africa, elections that have gone exactly the way we expected them to by regimes who made it practically impossible for the opposition to win. We saw it in Angola in 22, we saw it in Zimbabwe 23, and we've now seen it in Mozambique in 24. But within that context, within the region itself, we also saw a huge shift within South Africa. We saw something quite extraordinary happen in Botswana, and we saw not a not a change of power in Namibia, but definitely a shift there. Now, when the ANC lost its majority in South Africa and they were forced to go and negotiate with opposition parties to form the GNU, that did not go unnoticed in Mozambique. It did not go unnoticed in Botswana, and most certainly did not go unnoticed in Namibia. The same when the UDC defeated the BDP in Botswana. When we were talking to our Namibian colleagues and friends, they were talking about the fact that people in Namibia went like, well, maybe it is possible for the liberation movement to be defeated at the polls, provided we be given an opportunity. And so the turnout in Namibia, for instance, was very high. The voter turnout in both Botswana and Namibia was very high, higher than previous years. And a lot of that was down to youth vote. In the UDC, most likely won because the primary concern there was youth unemployment. And so young people turned out in their numbers. In Namibia, it didn't make that big a difference, but this was the first election where the number of people born after independence outnumbered those born before independence. And so this historical loyalty towards the liberation movements is something that's going to obviously lessen over time. It becomes difficult because ultimately countries run their own elections. And you asked the question earlier, you said, is ZANU-PF ever going to bow out? Are they ever going to lose an election in Zimbabwe? The reality is they have lost an election in Zimbabwe. Arguably, they've lost 2 or 3. True. But they have most certainly shown no indications that they're willing to bow out. The worst one, perhaps, was when they did enter into this sort of a government of national unity with Morgan Tsvangirai, and then afterwards made his life impossible, and kind of we went back to the default setting, again at the cost of many lives. But there are other shifts taking place elsewhere. We spoke about West Africa earlier. The situation in West Africa is not great. These coup countries are not showing a lot of signs of turning to civilian rule, the exception perhaps being Gabon. Gabon does have elections next year. They just passed a new constitution. That election will probably be won by General Bryce Ngwema. He's genuinely popular. And so you could argue that maybe it's not a perfect transition back to civilian rule, but there is movement there. That is a country that shows you that there is life after coups. Perhaps Ghana illustrates that best. It's a country that had coups many years ago, but here we are. And then, of course, events in Senegal will maybe resonate in a place like Cameroon. Next year has elections. It's 91-year-old President Paul Biya. We don't know whether or not he'll be running again. We don't know whether he'll be alive at this point in time. No one knows much about Paul Biya's health. The reality is that he's 91. So I think that for me, maybe the big takeaway for this year was that events in one country resonated into another, and there's a shift taking place in Southern Africa. We have elections in Malawi next year. Malawi is a country where also there's no party that can win 50% anymore. Those days are over. In fact, we haven't seen that since Bingu Mutharika won 50%, 10, 15 years ago. And so the dynamic in Malawi has changed, and it's changed permanently. There's really no indication that that country is ever going to go back to one-party rule. The big test perhaps next year would be Tanzania, where the CCM is proving to be very resistant to democratization. They just had an election where they absolutely had a whitewash, but where the opposition was also brutalized along the way. And so that's maybe another country that falls within that category of a liberation movement will do whatever it takes to remain in power. But that doesn't mean that there aren't other areas where there's a genuine move towards genuine democratization, even if, like we saw in Namibia, it doesn't necessarily translate into a change of power.
Absolutely. Before you answer my question on the strength of the institutions or an assessment of those institutions, democratic institutions, I wanted Charlie to come in and respond perhaps. Charlie?
Yeah, no, I was also curious about Cote d'Ivoire and what we're going to see in that election at the end of next year. I guess the thing I wanted to bring in was I did a piece on political longevity about 10 years ago. This was about Putin and Erdogan asking how long they were going to be in power, or the ANC in South Africa. And the main problem with people staying in power too long is corruption, that it gets you join the party in order to win contracts. You join the party because you know you'll make money if you join the party, and they've been in charge for 10, 20, 30 years or more. Yeah. So I'm saying it doesn't make much difference who's in charge. In that regard, it does disrupt these corruption kind of structures that get inbuilt. And so every time we see a change of government, it's very helpful. The other point I'd just add is I've just been reading this book by Rory Stewart, who was a UK minister in the 2010s, and he could have been leader of the Tory party. He lost to Boris Johnson, but it's fascinating to read about him coming into power and being able to make almost no difference. That government structure just carries on, and you can come in with your enthusiasm and your desire for change, and it's just so hard to actually achieve change, which is, I think, the underlying problem, which is why we then see a change of government 4 or 8 years later again, one party to the next, and everyone's always hoping that something will get better. But
Absolutely. We're running out of time. I mean, it's a fascinating discussion, and I really wanted to talk about those institutions. So perhaps, Louw, very quickly, if you can give me your take, because I want to talk about the changing demographic that we have that is instituting some of the change that we're talking about. Very quickly, Louw.
Institutions matter, and we've seen in these countries that we spoke about earlier where the elections went a certain way and were not credible. It was down to capturing those electoral commissions and making sure that the result was predetermined. But we had an election not so long ago in Zambia, won by our president Hishilema. I recall, Zaynab, you'll recall as well, we had discussed what his odds were against Edgar Lungu, and we said at the time that Hishilema could win if the election was fair-ish. It didn't even need to be a perfect election because his support was so overwhelming that he would still prevail even under those circumstances. And that proved to be the case. Democracy is certainly not perfect. We see elections all over the place, even in well-entrenched democracies and in Western countries, that the elections are absolutely imperfect. But the results, as long as one has the edifice of a democracy, then change is always possible. And so I think that much needs to be done on a multilateral level as well. We have countries like South Africa who has an outsized influence on its neighbors. And I don't think we're taking our responsibility seriously in terms of responding to botched elections elsewhere. So we haven't taken a leadership role in what's happening in Mozambique right now. We didn't take a leadership role in the pro-democracy protests in Eswatini. We've always given Zimbabwe a free pass. And so I would love to see these larger institutions, these bodies in Africa, take this more seriously. We saw ECOWAS trying to get more involved with the coup countries, and that backfired quite spectacularly. Of course, in the end, these countries then ended up opting out of ECOWAS and forming their own bloc. So there are risks involved as well there. But in other parts of the country, like Southern Africa in particular, we would like to see a bloc like SADC, and larger countries like South Africa take more responsibility. The SADC Observer Mission report in Zimbabwe after Zimbabwe's election, which was written by Nevis Mumba, former Zambian vice president, was very critical of that election and pointed out all these manifold problems with the system. And SADC didn't take that report seriously. It was eventually it was just tabled and it was filed away. And I think Nelson Chamisa put all his eggs in the SADC basket, and in the end, it proved fatal because SADC just wasn't willing to take action, and we saw yet another election get stolen. So yes, I think that maybe that would be my takeaway, where we're seeing enough democracy in order for governments to change, but we do need these larger bodies and larger countries to step up as well.
Absolutely. And your memory is fascinating. You reminded me of Jerry Rawlings in Ghana. Talk about coups in Ghana now, a thing of the past from a very long time ago indeed. Zaynab, you'll have the final word, if I may. And I'm asking the question whether Africa's youth really, in this instance, holds the key in terms of our progression to democracy.
Yes, definitely. I think for a very long time in the post-colonial era, the youth was largely neglected. And now we see, especially this year, but I mean, we saw it 2 years ago when William Ruto won in Kenya as well, that the youth they have their own set of demands, and they are willing to come out in their numbers to support the candidate that they feel that can implement policies that will benefit their socioeconomic circumstances. And then with the youth, I will add that there is an emphasis on economic return. So we are now on the continent, we are past just political freedom. Now the youth are demanding a certain level of economic circumstances to match that political freedom as well.
Yeah.
And of course, when socioeconomic circumstances improve, that then gives people the opportunity to become more engaged in democracy, and then
Yeah.
we are able to take the further step of strengthening those democratic institutions.
Yeah.
So while we are in a bit of a transition phase, and each country is in a different stage of that phase, I do think as a general trend that the youth are able to take this on, and they are able to raise their concerns and get leaders out of government that aren't delivering in the way that they should.
Absolutely. So Charlie said half full, Louw said half empty. Where do you stand?
I would say half full as a youth as well. I will say that being in South Africa and seeing how, among other young people, there was a lot more political engagement than I had ever witnessed since I started paying attention to politics. And the feeling is similar. And also with social media, we are much more interconnected than what we have ever been.
Yeah.
And I'm able to observe what's going on in Kenya. And for example, like Louw mentioned, the Namibians are able to observe what's happening in Botswana, and they are
Yeah.
able to say, "Oh, maybe we should go out because maybe we can.
Yeah.
Our voices will be heard, and we can make a change."
Yeah.
So on my side, I would say the glass is definitely half full.
2/3 from my panelists is for the glass half full. Zaynab, thank you. Africa analyst at Pangea Risk. Louw Nel, a senior political analyst, Oxford Economics, thank you. Charlie, thank you from London for joining this discussion.